This is the Valley Run Podcast from the ministry of Rocky Mountain Church in Estes Park, Colorado. Whether you're making your valley run for groceries, kids' games, or just need to get out of town, we pray today's message encourages you to elevate your awe for Christ in all things. Online at RockyMountainChurch.com. Here's your host, Pastor A.J. Dudek.
Well, thank you for tuning into our very first Valley Run podcast, episode 1. We are so excited to have you. And I just want to walk you through why do this? What's the point of this? As a pastor, I want to offer opportunities for us to tackle topics that maybe might not come from the pulpit on a regular basis. Here at Rocky Mountain Church, we love expository teaching. And we get to tackle a variety of things through that. And I believe the Bible speaks to all issues of life. But I would love to have this be in an environment where as you're heading down, making your valley run down the canyons, whether it's 34 or 36, you can be fed additionally on topics like parenting, marriage, leadership, culture, things that you think about, questions that you have. And that's why we're doing this. That's why we're having guests on, and we're walking through these issues. I get the privilege of bringing friends on the show, men and women that I've walked with through years of ministry, mentorship, and it's a joy for me to reconnect with folks and to talk through issues that pertain to everyday life, and that's really what the Valley Run podcast is going to be about. So, this is episode 1, and I thought I would start with one of my long time friends and mentors, Joe Urcavich, and we're tackling the topic today of emotional health as leaders. This month, we're going to be focusing on leadership, and so I get the privilege of having Joe on, and so we're going to jump in, and Joe has been, like I said, a mentor and a friend for many years. Joe has extensive experience as a leadership coach, public speaker, pastor, alignment advisor. He's really about promoting authenticity in relationship. He's a former chaplain for the Green Bay Packers, and he's just got a lot of in-depth experience with high-profile pressure situations and people. He's worked over 10 years with U.S. Army chaplains and officers in Alaska, Germany, and Washington, D.C., and he has served as keynote speaker for numerous corporate events, men's retreats, marriage conferences, and the like. He's got a great family. Joe is passionate about his family. He's married to Arliss, his college sweetheart, and they have parented 2 kids, and they've got 6 grandkids. So they're busy, and they're friends. They're mentors. They're great people. So here we go. We're going to jump in. Episode 1, Valley Run Podcast. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start asking the guests is, what's your favorite Estes Park memory?
Oh, man. I think probably is time spent with friends in Estes Park. Just being able to renew and nurture relationships, and you were a part of that, obviously, and Jen. That's always been a highlight for me, coming back to Estes, is just being able to re-solidify those relationships.
Yeah, I mean, you've spent a lot of years teaching at Ravencrest and just getting to know Chris and Bonnie and everybody, and I know when I was a student, you came out and taught, and that was really cool, growing up in Green Bay and at community, and As you think about your time, pastoring, being a consultant, working with the NFL, working with the military, why is emotional health as a leader so valuable to you, Joe?
The reason I think it's so valuable is because we feel before we think. And a lot of the decisions we make are rooted in our emotional temperament, which is shaped in our childhood around sometimes trauma, but sometimes positive reinforcement. And emotions can mislead us. So it's really important to understand the role that they can play in our life, positive and negative.
You had mentioned maybe one of the causes of, emotional instability or reactivity emotionally stems from childhood, not addressing maybe some trauma or situations there. Are there 2 or 3 things that you have identified in working with leaders that also play into that instability?
I think the most critical factor with that, AJ, is that leaders who are not aware of the emotional continuum they live on between who they are when they're consistent and inconsistent, leaders who aren't aware of that get hijacked emotionally in situations, and that throws confusion into, because the team looks to a leader to provide emotional stability and direction. And when that's not available to the leader, it's not going to be available to the team. So everybody suffers.
Yeah, no, that's why. Why do you think that causes that? I want to bring up 5 things that I think might be an issue that it causes that instability or that reactionary temperament. Are there, in your years, are there a couple of things, 2 or 3, that might be key motivators? I know you mentioned childhood and there's trauma there and there's unpacking and recognizing of that. Is there a few other things that you have found that rise to the surface in working with leaders that you can identify?
I think the primary factor that creates the instability in leaders is a deep rooted sense of insecurity. I'm not a psychologist, so I can't give you all the nuances to that, but that seems to be a common theme among leaders that I've worked with in business, in the church, in sports, insecurity, and that drives everything they do. Um, they're trying to compensate for something in their past that has made them believe that they're not capable or not enough. And so they're trying to prove something, usually to somebody else, like a dad or, an uncle or something like that, or to their mom if it's a female leader. But the reality is that it exists and it's a real thing. And helping people understand that is critical to their being the best they can be in given situations. That's my passion, is to help people take the next logical step.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I've seen you operate well in that passion. For you, having jumped into church ministry early on in your calling, when did you notice that was needed for yourself, Joe? Like, in that process, what brought that about in your own life, so now you can help young leaders develop in that way?
Well, it started when I was younger, honestly. Um, I grew up in a home where there was, my dad didn't have a dad. And so he is trying to figure out what it meant to actually mentor children and to develop them. And when I was 8 years old, I was traveling with my dad, who was a salesman for Keebler Company. So we got a lot of keys. But as I was traveling with him, he asked me, "How am I doing as a father?" That question burned into me. It was like, why are you asking me? What do I know about being a dad? In other words, he put me in a position without realizing it of critiquing his ability to actually function in the role he already possessed. And that started something in me. And I remember it vividly, the dialogue. It started something in me that has stuck with me ever since. And I don't fault him for it. He never had a father, and he wanted to be reminded of what he was doing that was well. And I had the opportunity on a number of occasions to tell him that he did the best he could do as a dad, and I understand that. And that's one thing I think with leaders who are insecure, when they begin to recognize that their model, whether it's a male or female, uh, when that model interacts with them, they're giving the best they have. Most people do not take on that role saying, "I want to screw this kid's life up."
Right, or I don't want to blow my church up or my business up. Like, that's never the intent of leaders. Well, having my own kids, my hope is that they look back on my parenting and say, my parents did the best that they could despite flaws and insufficiencies and stuff.
Yeah, and they gave you all they could give you. And that's the thing. Uh, you, I think every parent, I've seen this on the internet somewhere, I don't know where, but every parent wants to see their kid do better than they did in every area of life. I love my children. I love my grandsons, but you know what? I want all of them to learn to love more effectively than I have.
When we look at our culture, as a whole, I want to throw 5 things at you that might be causing emotional instability or friction or tension in our churches and our organizations, and I'd love to hear your response to each one. I'll name it, give a little definition, and then if you could just, in your experience, affirm that or speak about this a little bit more intensively, that would be helpful. The first is this. It's a term called reactivity, and here's the definition. The passions of the members govern and dictate both the mood of the body and its direction. Let me read that again. The passions of the members, all right, govern and dictate both the mood of the body and its direction. When you think of that term reactivity, how do we not operate in our passions but be aligned to something outside of ourselves? Have you seen that in your leadership over the years, Joe?
There's a fallacy in the premise, and that is that the church was never intended to be pure democracy, which is what you're advocating. The church was intended to be governed and led by a group of certified leaders called elders, and to be supplemented by deacons so that they could fulfill their responsibility of giving direction to the body. And the reality is that coalesces around a pastoral leader who has a responsibility to give direction. And unless he forfeits the moral authority he has in the position, he should be embraced.
Yeah.
His leadership can be challenged by other leaders, but he should be embraced as the leader. And the purpose of the board then should be to protect the leader, the primary leader, from the congregation, because things always get nasty in any group, and to protect the congregation from the leader. In other words, to make sure that there's a purity of purpose and direction.
How dangerous would it be if you didn't have a set of values or a mission or a vision that's outside of yourself to just operate based on passions of the individual members, say on a board or on a staff team or on an NFL team? Where have you seen that gone, south or blow up, if you will, in your experience?
We see it all the time. We see it in the political sphere. We see it in the sports sphere. We see it in our families. We see it in our churches. Any organization, if they're not centered around what their mission is and what their vision is and the values that are going to drive that, then you're left to the whims of individuals who want this, who want that, and it becomes a negotiation where everybody gets what they want at the expense of the whole, and then the whole thing collapses. So it's absolutely essential. And a lot of leaders try to get their fix by taking care of people rather than loving them enough to set direction and tell them the truth about where they either support or defer from the plan. Accountability is a really tough word. You see it really clearly in the sports world, because if there's no accountability, then you got people not doing their job. And of course, when you're dependent on other people to be effective, you need that accountability. The truth, that would be true in the military also. You have to have accountability because your lives are in each other's hands. So
Yeah.
it's a primary factor.
No, that's a good word. And if you get used to that way of doing church or doing a sports team or a business, you end up then adapting to the least mature members of the community all the time, and your passionate leaders suffer. They struggle with taking ownership. They get tired of the cyclical dysfunction. Have you seen that? You move from reactivity to this idea of herding. It's an us, not I mentality, where no one wants to take personal responsibility, maybe for their emotions or for their choices. And you begin to see that division in a group or in a team. And everyone's very sensitive about the most unstable or least mature member of that group. And that then becomes your vision. Those things become your values. Have you, how have you seen that in the church play out over the years?
Yeah, I think I've seen it a lot of times, and to me, it's rooted in the fact that um, people, first of all, are afraid to be responsible for their own voice. Um, they they're insecure, as we talked about earlier, and also we're predisposed in Western culture, at least in my estimation. I don't think I'm the only one that sees it this way. That we're always looking for the victim, and we're trying to have this concept of justice in front of us all the time. The reality is we want justice for you if you've made a decision as a leader, but we don't want justice for ourselves. We just want it for somebody else. That's human nature. And I'm not condemning. I'm just saying this is an observation. And it's an observation that I think is very true. So the reality is when you're dealing with people in a circumstance where there's tension that exists, I always try to remind people that tension's a good thing because it forces you to, first of all, understand what your vision, values, and expectations are. Are they in alignment with the group that you have tension with? If they're in alignment, then you're going to follow a process of being willing to have the real problem surfaced. Instead of picking the problem you want to point the finger at somebody, you have to look at what is the real issue here. And I would say in 95% of the cases, it's the individual has a problem and they want to visit it on the whole group. And they don't think then of the consequences of the choice they're making. They just snap to a solution that fits their criteria. And the responsibility of leadership is to go through that whole cycle and make sure they're holding themselves and the people who are under their authority to that process. Otherwise, it's just chaos. It's insurrection. It's just a mess.
In our culture, almost a race to who can play the greatest victim, because then they're given the greatest voice to give their opinions, to express their desires. That idea of blame displacement, and if you don't feed that victimhood, it seems to me like they almost view it as counter loving, counter grace, counter biblical sympathy. And how do you, in your experience, what are some ways that you can help someone who is stuck in that victimhood reality? How do you help them begin to heal maybe and move towards personal responsibility?
I think they have to have somebody who's been down that road themselves mentor them, because this is a deeply ingrained philosophical outlook on life. It's not just a fly by night thing. Part of it may even go back to how we as Christians present the whole concept of responsibility when it comes even to our spiritual state. Many Christians, the old Flip Wilson thing from when I was a young person, you may not remember this, but his favorite tagline was "The devil made me do it." And
Yeah.
he always had an excuse. And that's kind of the mentality in society. I'm not responsible. Somebody else made me do it. And I can't help myself. And until a person looks in the mirror and sees the person they really are and the impact they're actually having, not what they hope they're having, but what they're actually having, they're going to be content to play the game everybody in society plays. And that's why it's important for us to be retrospective about where we're at, what we're trying to do, both as leaders and people in a subordinate role. We have to be willing to be self-reflective. And that's a painful process because unless you look into the mirror and see the potential disgusting individual you are, you can never find the ability to really give your heart to somebody when it's for their best interest, because you're always trying to hide from yourself.
Yeah, and you mentioned this importance of having people that have walked that road, that know what it's like, can come alongside of you and be that objective presence in your life to say, hey, I see this thing, it's dangerous, make sure you deal with that, wrestle with that. And you've been that for me for many years. I remember very vividly some conversations where you were flat out like, hey, AJ, this ain't cooking well. and at the time as a young leader, you you struggle with those words, but as you get older, you realize the importance of cherishing those relationships because they have high value. And it leads me to this next thing where as you grow as a leader, you take ownership, you see yourself rightly, you can handle that short-term acute pain over tolerating long-term chronic pain in an organization. Like I think a lot of people assume, and I think it's natural for us as humans, that we don't like conflict. We hope it'll just go away. What's the danger in choosing long-term chronic pain over short-term acute pain in dealing with tensions, whether it's in a church or organization? What's your take on that, Joe?
Well, pain is pain, whether we label it long term or short term, and pain leaves a mark. And so, no matter what pain you're dealing with, um, it's what you choose to do with it that'll indent your soul, so to speak, in more profound ways. And so, our goal is not to dismiss pain as individuals. Our goal is to embrace pain and look into it as a pit almost, if you want, and try to understand the purpose it can serve for us. Most of us look at pain and we want to run from it. Let's take a pill from the doctor. Let's do this. Let's do that. No, pain gives us a way of valuing life in a different way. And unless we can embrace it, we miss the opportunity to grow as an individual and to put pain in a proper perspective. Personal story, AJ, on that.
Yeah.
11 years ago, my friend, a doctor friend of mine, Steve Gurnt, did a test on me. And in that test, he discovered that I had many blockages going to my heart. And he said, you're not going home from the hospital. You're going to the intensive care unit. We're going to do surgery tomorrow. Call your kids and have them come. Now, that shook me up a little bit, as you can well imagine.
Yep.
The next morning at 5 o'clock, my children were there and some of my grandchildren. We talked through the circumstances I was facing because Steve had said very directly, you may not make it through this, and you need to understand this is a major surgery. And so he went in and opened me up, and he did 8 bypasses on me. I was so weak afterwards, I couldn't move. I had to have help with everything I did. And the reality is that pain caused me to reflect on pain differently than anything else, because I saw pain within the light of what it brings to life. If I hadn't had that pain, I wouldn't know that I would value life as much as I do now. I value it way beyond what I ever did before.
Well, and Steve knew there was a sense of urgency. We've got to deal with the issue because there's no room for long-term chronic, symptom management here. We've got to nip this thing. That's a really good picture. I know leaders. I know for myself, at times I've been afraid of dealing with conflict, afraid of addressing the urgent, with hopes that over time I'd rather manage the chronic things and hope that it resolves. How is that dangerous in an organization or a church if we don't deal with the urgency of an issue as it relates to the overall health of the future of the organization? How would you encourage leaders to address the fears they have with conflict?
I would say the first thing that comes to mind around that is that you have individuals who many times are trying to justify themselves, say in a church congregation, at the expense of the whole group. And when you have that going on, it creates an environment where people rally to the person because they see the pain they're in. And they want to alleviate the pain. Let's take it away from them, and we can say nice things like I'm praying for you or whatever, and it makes us feel good about ourselves. The fact is we're having no impact on their situation, because the reality is when a person's in pain because of choices they're making and they're transferring that pain to people around them, they need to be told, hey, I appreciate the fact that you're struggling with this issue, but the fact is you're using it as a weapon said you're committed to. it's like a couple that's married and one of them has an affair, but they decide they're going to patch it up. But every day the person who was offended brings it up. I mean, uh, even if you failed me, and I've been in situations like this where I know that I was unjustly treated by people. And even if you're in that position yourself, you're still in control of making a choice about how will I suffer through this situation that confronts me. And if I suffer by making others suffer, that even compounds my failure. It's terrible. And people put up with it. I don't get that part of it. I would tell somebody very directly if they were a friend, honestly, in that situation, like, look, dude, if you can't handle this suffering you're in, I don't want to be a friend with you because you don't utilize my skill set to help you step beyond it. I
Well,
have to step away from you.
I've benefited in having you as a mentor in that very sense of walking through the suffering, walking through the tension, and it's helped me coach and almost disciple or catechize folks in ministry to do the same. Of the tension, as you said, it's not bad. The pain is not bad. It's going to happen, and if you're a leader, man, you've got a higher chance of that happening probably more often because you're leading people, right? And I think, when I think of that, the term failure of nerve comes to play. I think leaders get so overwhelmed, they get tired, they get exhausted, and specifically pastors, me being one and you having been one. There's days where they want to just go sell car insurance, right? They assume that if I leave my post here, pain and tension and conflict isn't going to exist anywhere else. How would you encourage, specifically maybe a pastor, to stay in the game? If he feels called to this position, what are some encouraging words that you would have, having many years in pastoral ministry, Joe?
This is going to sound terrible, AJ,
yeah,
but pain allows leaders, positional leaders, to understand they don't belong in the game. And that's true in every area. And it's not just unique to the church. Because if we believe, which I believe is true, that insecure people seek positions to make them feel valuable,
yes,
that many times they're not equipped to really handle the responsibility of being in a primary role. And so I think it's a ferreting out process, and we ought to pay keen attention, not to what other people are doing, but about who we are and how we respond in the turmoil. That tells you whether you're fit for service or not.
hmm
And the reality is, anybody in any situation who is under public scrutiny wants to quit at some point. Just like, I'm had it. These idiots don't know what they're doing.
exactly.
Being around the sports world, I hate sitting in the stands at a football game or a basketball game because everybody's an expert.
Right.
They're all telling you what you should or shouldn't do, and they have no clue about the sophistication of what's going on the field or court. The same is true when the church. Everybody's a spectator. Everybody has an opinion. They listen to each other, and most of your thoughts are going to be negative thoughts anyway, because that's how we're conditioned in society. And so most people don't even understand that about themselves. They think that's normal. It's normal in the sense that that's the way we work. But the fact is, it creates hassles for everyone else. So anyway, that's a kind of a rabbit trail, but that's my take, that pain actually puts you in a position of evaluating yourself. You don't have to begin by evaluating others. Look at yourself. And if you realize that you are the leader who was intended to walk through this garbage with people, then you're going to walk through it. And you won't do it perfectly, but you're going to give your best intentions, and you're going to hold your fire for the moments that really matter.
Yeah, in your leadership over the years, walking through that tension, walking through the difficult relational things, the difficult choices you have to make as a leader, how do you stay emotionally healthy through that? What are some things that have helped you, Joe, remain stable in the midst of chaos, whether it it's exercises you have or tools or suggestions. Do you have a few that come to mind that would benefit leaders listening to this that want to lead, they want to stay, they want to have longevity in their leadership? What advice do you have for them to kind of stay in the game?
I think you need committed leaders around you who agree philosophically with where you're at, what your mission is, what your vision is, what your values are, what your expectations are. You need some solid people around you to stand with you. Nobody can do this alone. And the fact is, you have to be able to communicate with people about the misgivings you have in yourself. I can remember years ago, I have a friend who's a psychologist, and we were sitting in a hot tub talking, and a particularly tumultuous season. And I said, I got to ask you a question as a psychologist. And I explained the situation to him, and I said, do you think I'm going crazy? Because this seems irrational to me.
Yeah.
And he said, Joe, you can handle one or two tough situations in life at the same time. But when you get to three or four, you start to fragment. It doesn't mean you're going crazy, but it means the load is too great to bear in that moment. And so, no, I don't think you're going crazy, but you're carrying a load right now. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because I've worked with other leaders and I've watched them in the midst of that situation. And it gives me great compassion for them. I can move toward them, understanding the load that exists and where to actually move toward them in a way that can help reinforce them in the direction they want to go as primary leaders. And it's funny to me that it's the proven people who take the biggest hits generally. It really is. The people who skate by doing the immediate thing to try to make people feel good, they tend to get away with it, and then they check out and go to the next town or something when things get rough.
Yeah. Because there's always going to be tension, right? There's always going to be conflict, and learning how to manage that. That's been a process for me as a pastor over, the last 12 or 13 years, is how do I remain emotionally healthy in the blender of conflict and ministry. And if it wasn't for mentors, if it wasn't for, my wife, Jen, speaking clarity and asking good questions of me and how I'm doing, seasons of disconnect. I just came off the heels of going to Montana with a group of 22 ministry leaders, and it was just a refuge, really, of being able to be vulnerable, having spaces where you can be honest without additional arrows coming your way because you've been honest. And that's such a blessing, and those are sweet seasons. Any advice for a 21-year-old young ambitious leader who is got a positive view of the future, doesn't have a lot of context yet in leading? What would you say to our young leaders, men and women, who they have the right hearts, they're getting after it, they're getting their education, they're setting themselves up? What are a couple things that you would speak into their lives about, Joe?
I would say, first of all, don't be ambitious to be the lead person. Find somebody who's a proven asset and work under their leadership. Subordinates never understand the arrows you take as a primary leader on their behalf. And then the person that desires to be the key leader, I'd say that, secondly, if you're ambitious for that and you're willing to go for whatever you can to maybe undercut a senior leader or something, realize that tells you you're disqualified. You really don't belong in that kind of role, because the fact is you can't handle the responsibility. The responsibility is to something bigger than yourself. And so I think that's the best thing I can say to young leaders, particularly in the church. Don't do it. Don't try to do it on your own. Don't try to be the next big name. We've seen what happens to big names.
Yes.
They go down like a ton of bricks a lot of times because they don't have the support mechanisms around them. And I would say that is a critical component. Get along under somebody who can nurture you and build you and help you become all you can be to take on responsibility. I've watched individuals who are highly successful in subordinate roles in the world of sport. But when they get into the head coaching position, they fail.
Hmm.
And it's not that they're not knowledgeable. Listen, people at every level in sport have a certain amount of knowledge, and they're very knowledgeable people many times. It has to do with how they've developed those relational components and the ability to handle the tension in the moment to build something beyond themselves that really matters.
Yeah. No, that's so true. And man, you've spoken into my life over the years on that very thing. And like I said, for young leaders, if I was going back to my 21-year-old self, I'd say the same. I'd say, AJ, you've got to have people that can speak into your life, and you've got to sit under leaders that you can learn from while learning how to manage up, like learning how to harness all that energy and excitement, and if you're a visionary, how to deal with all that without sabotaging yourself or the place you work in. And we've heard don't burn your bridges and all that good stuff, but it's so true. We're running out of time here, brother. I know for you, you've got to get moving. Where can folks reach you if they're looking for consulting work in their business or sports program or even church?
Yeah, I would say they could just go to my Hotmail address, AJ. It's simply Joseph Urcavich at hotmail.com, and you have access to that, so you know where it's at.
Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate you, brother. I love you. Thanks for just sharing your experience and fielding questions and dealing with my mountain internet. And yeah, maybe we'll see each other in Estes down the road here.
I hope so. You too, and Jen, and your family. You guys take care.
Take care, brother.